Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 4th annual Celebrating Women in Conservation Breakfast, which is proudly presented by Trust for Nature and supported by Bush Heritage Australia. My name is Tanya Ha. I'm an environmental campaigner and science journalist, and it's my delight to be your MC for today's proceedings. We'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and we pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and also to their families that may be here today. I'd also like to extend a warm and slightly awkward welcome to the many men in the room here today. Thank you for joining us to celebrate women in conservation. Now, today we're getting in early to acknowledge International Women's Day, and we're delighted to have with us an internationally recognised leader in global sustainability who has experience spanning over 30 years. Molly Harriss Olson is currently CEO for Fairtrade Australia and New Zealand, and we're very much looking forward to having a chat with you, Molly, after breakfast this morning. We'd also like to welcome the Honourable Lisa Neville, the Minister for Environment, Climate Change and Water and Member for Bellarine. Now, I know how incredibly busy ministers' diaries are, so we really are. It means a lot to the people in this room that you're joining us here today for this event, so thank you very much for joining us. And another special welcome this morning is, of course, our sponsor, National Australia Bank, affectionately known as NAB. Where's the NAB table? Oh, they're behaving very politely, no whoops or anything like that. So welcome. Events like this, they're not possible without the support of corporate partners, so thank you very much for your involvement this morning. Now, we're going to have a business card draw. There are a number of business card door prizes that are on offer this morning, so we do encourage you to drop your card into the bucket at the entry, or Amelia is going to wander around the room through today during breakfast, so pop the card into the bowl or bucket. The first prize is a golf day for 4 people at the Sandhurst Club. The second prize is a 12-month Sanctuary magazine subscription and also a harvest box. And how many of you have been here at events in previous years? Any people returning for another breakfast? Welcome back, good to see you again. For those that are familiar, they might be surprised to learn that we're not actually going to have a raffle this year. We're doing something a little bit different. Instead, we're going to have an online survey with some prizes so that we can get some feedback. So do go online after this morning's breakfast and complete the online survey. And there's an address for it here on the back of today's program. For those that complete the survey, it's just about a 5-minute survey. They go into the draw to win 2 return tickets to Auckland with Flight Centre, and the value of that prize is $1,200. So do take the program home with you, and that includes the link to the entry. Now it gives me great pleasure to invite up to the stage the Trust for Nature CEO, Victoria Miles. Please make her welcome.
Thanks, Tanya. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, welcome to our 4th Women in Conservation breakfast to celebrate International Women's Day. To begin with, I also would like to acknowledge the members of the Kulin Nation, traditional custodians of the land upon which we're meeting, especially the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung, and their elders past and present, and also elders from any other communities who might be here today. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of the Honourable Lisa Neville, who has been able to come and be with us today. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Ellen Sandell, who is the member for the local seat of Melbourne, and of course our very important keynote speaker today, Molly Harriss Olson. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsor, NAB, for their terrific support of this breakfast. Our sister covenanting organisations are also here today from New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania. It's been fantastic that you've been able to come. Thank you very much. And of course, I'd like to welcome all the covenantors. Covenantors are people who have voluntarily chosen to become long-term land managers for the benefit of Victorians now and in the future. And of course, the many donors, supporters and friends of Bush Heritage and Trust for Nature. Thank you all very much for coming. It's a really early start, I get it, and it's really great that you've all been able to come, so thank you. Bush Heritage and Trust for Nature are really proud to be co-hosting this event, and that's because amongst all the many things we have in common, we've got lots of things in common. In fact, our location is one of the things we have in common, but the two critical things that we have in common are that we are concerned with conservation on private land, and we are concerned with long-term permanent protection of that land. So today we're celebrating the role and contribution of women in conservation, and we are going to be hearing a conversation between two very significant women in this field. They're going to be talking about the emerging field of impact investing and the potential that that holds for investors and conservation organisations alike. There's a lot of work, I think, ahead of us in that field, and we're going to be hearing about some of the things that are happening there. One of the other themes that you're going to hear about is collaboration. Collaboration is really important in the environment. There's probably not one organisation or one individual in this room that could make long-term and meaningful change alone. We have to be working together, and this is particularly important in the conservation area, where we are each year losing a significant amount of our natural heritage assets. In Victoria alone, we lose up to 4,000 hectares a year. And, of course, everyone in this room is reliant on our natural assets. We might not think about it like that, but we are reliant on them for clean water, unpolluted air, fertile soil, and also disaster resilience. All of these things require really healthy ecosystems. And what we're going to be hearing about today as well is some of the work that's being done in this area to figure out how to measure and evaluate those services and the metrics that are being developed so that we can disseminate that information and all learn more about how these services can be valued. And this work involves consensus of many different people, from individual landowners and consumers through to large multinational corporations and governments. It involves all of us. And of course, to come back to the theme of today, there is growing evidence to suggest that empowering women is one of the single most important ways that you can drive change. And we know that our keynote speaker today is doing a lot of work in places where that is occurring. And even here in the Western world, it's incredibly important that we continue to see women in all sorts of roles in conservation doing all sorts of things. It's really only through consensus, where all voices are going to be heard, that we can make a difference. So conservation is not soft or easy work, it's very hard work, and we know that there are a lot of women and men in the room today who work in this area. And International Women's Day is a time for us, I think, to be able to mark that contribution and to say this is the work that we're doing, and to collectively thank everybody for that effort. So I hope that today provides some great networking opportunities. We are really thrilled to see so many people here. I hope that you enjoy the networking opportunity that this provides, and also that you're going to hear things today that inspire you to think about how we can approach the environment and conservation differently, and to ensure that we have a healthy environment, thriving communities, and of course, thriving economies. So thank you very much for being here. It's terrific, and I'll now hand over to our MC, Tanya.
Thank you, Victoria. Trust for Nature works with NAB across several areas. NAB is committed to understanding and managing the environmental aspects and impacts, but also the dependencies of their businesses. They recognise that biodiversity and ecosystem services are essential to sustaining human wellbeing, and acknowledge that they need to be better understood. In that way, companies can better understand and have an evidence base for dealing with the associated risks and recognising the opportunities. I'd now like to invite up to the stage Sasha Corville from NAB to say a few words. Please make her welcome.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. NAB is very pleased to be supporting Trust for Nature and Bush Heritage with this wonderful breakfast event. The themes of the discussion linking diversity and inclusion, fair trade, social enterprises, impact investing, and the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services are all priority issues for NAB, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about how they intersect in the conversation between Molly and Tanya. Addressing sustainability challenges that we all face as a global society and as local communities will require a number of things: leadership, vision, collaboration, as Vic has mentioned very, very strongly, determination and commitment. But they're also going to require capital. As a bank, NAB has a role to play in driving capital to where it's needed. And we're really, really excited about the potential for impact investing. Yet, we recognize that currently the opportunities for impact investing in Australia are scarce. This is partly because the mission-driven organizations that can really benefit and drive change through impact investing currently lack experience in managing revenue-generating activities enterprises. So with this in mind, and to address this gap, to really drive the future of impact investing, we've launched a $1 million Impact Investment Readiness Fund that will provide grants of up to $100,000 for mission-driven organizations to invest in their initiatives and get investment ready. We hope that this will provide some initial boost, some emphasis, some really just stimulus to grow the impact investing market in Australia. And we hope to see social as well as environmental biodiversity conservation initiatives coming up in the impact investing space in the near future. The fund opens on the 10th of March and can be used for mission-driven organizations to purchase specialized capacity-building support from providers such as advisory, financial, intermediary, legal services. So it's just one little thing to watch out for, and I hope that we see a lot of really exciting impact investing activities coming up in the near future. But that's enough for me. Thank you very much, and enjoy your breakfast.
Molly Harriss Olson was named one of the 2014 Australian Financial Review 100 Women of Influence. Molly has convened, chaired and been a member of several sustainability initiatives over more than 3 decades, including the World Economic Forum's Global Leaders of Tomorrow Sustainability Index initiative. Molly worked in the White House as the founding executive director of the President's Council on Sustainable Development, appointed by President Clinton. But she couldn't resist Australia's beautiful land and people, so she moved here permanently, and we are all the better for it. Molly is the founder and convener of the National Business Leaders Forum on Sustainable Development and the co-founder of EcoFutures and Earthmark. She also served on the board of Green Building Council of Australia and the AMP Sustainable Investments Alpha Advisory Boards, and she's currently the CEO of Fair Trade Australia and New Zealand. Now, another famous American lady is Eleanor Roosevelt, and she once said that a woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong it is until it's in hot water. And Molly's career has included the occasional period of time in hot water. For example, she has been campaigning with Greenpeace against drilling for oil in the southern right whale calving grounds. And as a result of those actions, BHP decided to sue her. Now, as Molly makes her way to the stage, we're going to see a video flashback to that era. Now, we thought we'd show that delightful video, Molly, because it introduces this pervading idea that I'm sure you all find frustrating, the idea that it's business versus the environment. Can environmental outcomes coexist with economic outcomes? And what's been your experience, for example, working with Fair Trade International on bringing about benefits for the community that are both economic and environmental as well?
Indeed, indeed. That false dichotomy has been around for a long time, and it seems to be one that just won't die. I can remember during the Clinton campaign for his presidency, we had to pull together all the materials about jobs versus the environment, and it was always jobs versus the environment, the economy versus the environment. What we really know now is that you can't have a thriving economy or a prosperous economy without a solid natural capital base, without a natural resource base, and without a healthy environment. And this is absolutely true in fair trade. Fair trade is one of these extraordinary organizations where I truly think if the whole world were using these principles of trade justice, we would have a much more sustainable global economy. Because these farmers are out there on the coalface, literally, where the impacts of climate change are right on top of them. And so we have a number of initiatives to try to help them minimize erosion, adapt to climate change, and to see these people who have had the least impact on the climate actually getting the first and the worst of the impacts of it, the consequences, is really quite devastating. But I do believe it's a completely false economy, and I think more and more and more, every aspect of society, from business to government to all of us NGOs that have been working in it for so long, understand that very deeply now.
But I guess part of that is bringing big business, so to speak, on side. You know, how did you go for all, what happened? How did you go from BHP slapping you with a lawsuit to now being on the same page as big business?
Yes, well, I would have to say it's a discerning point. Not all big business is there. It's a very, very narrow band of business that actually really does understand it. In the BHP case, luckily I had no assets. So at the time I was young, but it was one of those early slap suits where they were just trying to shut me up, and that was exactly what Bob Brown and the team in Tasmania faced. So it was quite intimidating to actually be sued for millions of dollars by the big Australian. But I would have to say that I think even BHP has learned over the years, and I know my husband, who was running the Australian Conservation Foundation for many years, tried to convince them that Octedi was a bad idea. They would have saved billions, I think, if they had actually listened to him at the time. So I think it's been a long and hard lesson, but I think many in the business sector now do understand that not only is it a license to operate, not only is it corporate responsibility, but actually, all the things we once thought were too costly, like safety, like environment protection, are actually good for business in the long run.
Do you think that's what's been behind this move towards impact investing?
Absolutely, and I think the fantastic thing is to see the continuum. When I was an undergraduate and then later doing my graduate work at Yale, I studied economics, and I was actually deeply interested in economics. One of my degrees as an undergraduate was in economics. And at the time, we would look at things like the cost-benefit of something. And I can remember arguing profusely with my Yale professor of economics, saying, he said the only way to measure the value of a spotted owl, which is a highly endangered species, was the net present value of the forest in which the owl lived. And I kept arguing, I don't know what the answer is, but that's not the answer. It is absolutely not the case. And now we have, the fantastic work of Gretchen Daly and so many economists around the world that are doing work on ecosystem services. And we're identifying very specifically that, something like the Catskills in the New York, surrounding New York City, save New York billions in terms of its water catchment and water purification systems by just retaining that natural capital in the system. So in terms of impact investing, that's kind of the next thing on the continuum, which is just so exciting to see that we can recognize there are multiple benefits and there are multiple ways to get a return on investment that actually not only don't do negative things to the world, but actually do really positive things in the world.
A lot of the examples that are well known that are out there often have social outcomes, and I guess those human stories of better pay conditions, better working conditions, I guess it's in some ways it's people, so as fellow humans we can relate to them. Do you think that the social benefits are an easier sell, so to speak, than conservation benefits?
Not at all. I mean, that's such an interesting question, because I guess my life started in conservation. My first job was with the National Audubon Society, and of course, as we know from the Greenpeace work, I have done environment work for most of my career, and the work with the social side of sustainability has been a latecomer for me. And I think that these things ebb and flow. I think that at one point it was easier to buy a block of conservation land than it was to try to figure out what are the social dimensions of these problems. But I think the great thing is that there are different not-for-profits and different organizations working in all those spaces. So I think that with the environment, I guess, the challenges with things like climate change and the impacts on landscape scale, habitats is just so enormous that trying to get a grip on the problem at that scale is going to require massive, massive investments. But you look at the US, where I think it's 5.6 billion is going to go into conservation investments in the next 5 years. And that's incredibly heartening, because you really feel like people are starting to see that there are returns on investments for these kinds of initiatives, and they will have multiple benefits.
Do you think that things like, I mean, it's one of those catch-22s, on one hand, you don't want to see natural disasters and climate change and bushfire and these things happen, but do you think that some of the natural disasters we have seen in Australia in recent years, do you think that that's starting to build that appreciation and valuing of the natural environment and the understanding that it is fragile to a certain degree?
I think, unfortunately, we're creatures that respond to immediate threats. I mean, that's the way our brain is designed and wired. So when we see someone suffering those threats, all of a sudden, it becomes personal. So unfortunately, I think that is a motivating factor. And I know for a long, long time, whenever there were huge weather events, there was no connection to the sort of issues about climate, and now there seems to be more and more people that actually do understand that connection and do say, oh my gosh, we have to do something about it. And unfortunately, we just have to learn to think a little bit longer term and recognize that threats like climate change, threaten everything.
Well, it's one thing that I find interesting is that for Australia, our landscape, the idea that we're the sunburnt country, we have these beaches and beautiful sort of the outback, that it is part of our cultural identity and it's part of also what we sell to the rest of the world. Do you think there's potential in overlapping conservation, say, with ecotourism? Because that's an export.
Well, there always has been. I mean, I actually did my honours thesis here in Australia on economic alternatives to oil drilling on the Great Barrier Reef, because when I was doing my honours work, they were still considering it. I couldn't even believe it. The economic alternatives are vast, whereas oil drilling on the Barrier Reef would have been the stupidest thing we could have ever done. In fact, I still think that letting cargo ships go through the Barrier Reef and some of the fishing technologies we're using is still silly. But I think that with things like ecotourism, it is a long-term and very viable economic activity. And again, we're getting much more sophisticated in our economic understanding about long-term prosperity versus short-term exploitation.
Is that something that you've seen, being a board member of Green Building Council Australia? I mean, if you go back, say, 10 years when it was first established, I think in Melbourne we had 60L and there weren't that many examples. Now Docklands has the highest concentration in the country of 5-star and more rated buildings. Now that these buildings have a performance history, do you think that's starting to shift, that thinking of environment versus economics?
Absolutely, and what a great organisation. And it was a great privilege for 6 years to serve on that board. They have now amassed quite a long record of not only is, and Fair Trade is about to move into a 5-star Green Star building in the Docklands. So we're very excited about this, a brand new building. But look, the track record is phenomenal. Not only is it saving water, saving energy, the buildings are cheaper to operate, and the return on investment for them is consistently higher than other, just regular commercial transaction buildings. But the other really profoundly important impact, which I'm hoping to see with my team, is you actually get a 32% reduction in sick leave, and you get between 15 and 20% higher productivity rates when you have fresh air and natural light in a building. And finding a building in Melbourne that has fresh air and natural light is actually quite difficult, especially in the CBD. So, it's fantastic, and they're starting to be able to amass enough data that you can really see it in black and white.
So I guess it is one of those examples where environment and human concerns, that people are part of the environment.
Absolutely, and also it connects that other thing, which is that it's an investment. Just to go back to our theme of impact investing, when you invest in something like a green building, you're not only doing the best thing for your employees, the best thing for the environment, for climate change and for water, etc., but you're actually getting an investment that's going to have a higher return.
What are some other examples?
Oh, there's some fantastic examples around, from Africa right through to what NAB is doing with their green bonds. There's so many examples now of investments that are actually proving to be multiply beneficial. Macau, I think, has done some interesting work in this social investing space as well. So I think now there's so many examples that there's no excuse not to know that you can spend your money in a way that has these multiple benefits.
So tell us a little bit more about impact investing. How is it different, say, to microfinance or other similar programs that are encouraging better social corporate outcomes?
Well, it's focused on engaging private capital to have these outcomes. So if I use an example, Fair Trade set up a thing called the Fair Access Fund. And I can remember on the international board, we had debates and debates and debates about investing $100,000, which seemed like a massive amount of money at the time. And within the first 12 months, we were able to unlock $13 million in this access pool that enabled farmers to draw on these funds to invest in their farms in various ways. So it might be productivity and quality, it might be to train people about child labor or gender issues. And within the second year, we'd unlocked the power of 25 million. So this one little $100,000 that the Fair Trade International Board kind of put in the pool unlocked all this private investment to enable all this activity to go on. And now we have this fund that's available for farmers. So it works in a way to access the private capital that's out there to do good in the corporate space and public space.
So I guess, to use a familiar saying, it's using capital to, instead of buying a man a fish and feeding him for a day, then buying a man a fishing rod and
teaching him how to fish. Letting him learn how to fish.
Yeah.
Indeed, indeed.
Now, one thing that, I guess this idea of that this is investing in solutions to environmental and social problems in a way that also has financial benefits as well. And I can see how that would come into conversations of aid. And tell us a bit about the partnership with DFAT, because I know for one that when I saw that in the media, I thought, oh, wow, that was unexpected.
It was unexpected for us too, because Fair Trade is just about to turn 10 this year and has never been able to get a penny out of, well, there may be a few little bits and pieces, but nothing significant out of government for the work that we do. We don't have poster children, we don't have members, we're not the kind of organization that's sort of a traditional NGO in that space. We are much more entrepreneurial in the way that we approach what we do, and we're basically helping farmers to learn how to protect the environment, how to grow a crop, and how to do it in a way that enables a global market. So this Trade for Aid initiative is a profoundly important one for us. It's, I think, the first partnership that the government established, and it's to raise awareness and increase the number of companies engaged in fair trade in the Australian market really. And the back end of it is to do more work in country. So we're increasing the work that we do in the Pacific. We already work in a number of countries in the Pacific, and we've already, through this initiative, started working with a Brisbane company called Queen Vanilla in Tonga, where we hope to bring back the Tongan vanilla industry. So it's a very exciting initiative, and we believe it has enormous potential to help our near neighbours to enable themselves through these modest investments. It'll unlock a lot of corporate finance and corporate partners and a lot of consumer engagement, we hope. And it will enable our near neighbours to have a hand up rather than a handout.
So I guess that really emphasises Fair Trade Australia and New Zealand as the local arm of an international organisation addressing a global issue. Is that something that you find as a good exchange of information and a local linking of farmers in our region with brands here and potentially overseas as well? How do those international relationships work?
Well, for me, it's been fantastic because, of course, I had 6 years on the board and was the chair of the international board, which, coming back then to the Australian context and to this region, is very, very exciting. Australia's about Fair Trade's about 25 years old, and it started in Europe and Latin America, sort of trades in coffee. On the board in those last 6 years, we invested heavily in Africa and brought sort of the number of producers up. Now we sit in Australia on the rim of Asia, where we have the biggest opportunity for South-South markets. So we have new markets in India, Hong Kong, Taiwan. But the Australian-New Zealand office is the largest of all the fair trade offices in the region. So I just actually last night got back from our Asian producer network in India, And the work that we're doing to connect the supply chains with producers, to grow the producers, and then connect supply chains into Australia, New Zealand, and the markets in the region is very, very exciting indeed, and one that's supported by the DFAT work.
Actually, on that note, zooming out from fair trade to sort of the bigger picture and some of the global environmental issues that we're facing, like climate change, is Australia a small player or a big player? You know, what can we do on the international stage? How significant are we? Do we punch above our weight, as we like to say?
We always want to know that. Look, we definitely punch above our weight. And if you look at key people in key positions around the world, I often marvel at how many are Australian. Folks like, I know he's retired now, but Jim Wolfenson, who ran the World Bank. There's people pocketed everywhere. Look, I think Australia has the opportunity to do a lot more than it's doing at the moment. I think that we have in the past been able to lead. I often think about Canada when I think of the opportunity for Australia, because Australia can do fantastic things, and in fact on stuff like the emissions trading schemes that it was doing, and I think what it's doing now on trade for aid, it has these huge opportunities and was leading, really, very significantly. Canada, though, is a great example because Canada is one of those allies to the United States who doesn't just follow, but actually says, yes, we're your allies, but no, we won't fight your wars for you. Yes, we're your allies, but we won't, do this or that. So we won't, stop doing our work in climate change. So I think Australia can and does punch above its weight. I have to say, when I think about sort of my heroes in the world, and Eleanor Roosevelt's one of them, I'd have to say that Julie Bishop is an incredibly impressive person, and as someone who worked, devotedly to Clinton and Gore, she is impressive. She is really, really committed to the outcome she sees that fair trade can have in this region, and I think that there is, there is significant opportunities. But what worries me sometimes about Australia is that we fail to see that our leverage isn't in the market. Very quickly, our Indian fair trade market is going to, completely eat up the Australian market when it really gets off the ground. So it's not in that kind of weight. It's in our influence amongst the global community. So it was great to see in the G20, for instance, that some of these key issues came up on the agenda, that things like climate change were kind of forced onto the agenda. And I think we have this incredible opportunity, but we have to seize the opportunity for that leveraging of influence rather than being actually the marketplace, because we're never going to be a big marketplace. We're sort of the population of greater LA.
So getting back to impact investments, what are some of the challenges and successes for private organisations like Trust for Nature and Bush Heritage? Do you think that they can develop impact investment initiatives and monitor true impact?
Look, I think they're already doing some brilliant work. I know Trust for Nature's got a revolving fund where they invest and then resell and invest and resell. That's exactly the kind of thing that impact investing is about, and they were doing that long before the term impact investing, I think, was even around. Similarly, Bush Heritage has done so much over the years to show the world a different model of how we can, access private investments in landscape scale. I mean, the thing that I love about where these organizations are is they're not just talking about, saving this little bit of Bilby land, although sometimes that's part of it. They're really looking at Kosciuszko to the coast. How do you actually get landscape scale investments, and how do you then turn those over so that you can get the next block and the next block moving? So they've got some fantastic examples of how that works.
I guess that is quite important, that mix of public and private land, especially when we have the risks of, say, habitat islands forming and not having that large, broad spread. Are there other examples that you've seen overseas of that sort of thing happening on that kind of scale?
Well, everywhere. I mean, I think the figures were that 82% of the global investment in conservation in this impact investment space is in the US, which means basically that the rest of the world could be doing a lot more. But it's not just a blip at the moment. It actually is quite a significant and growing trend. And when we look at banks like Macau and like NAB, major banks are getting involved in it. It reminds me actually of the Grameen Bank, which started out as this tiny little loan of $40 to a few women. Citibank was then trying to, jump into the act. So it's now it's a field of investment, which it wasn't just a few years ago.
And I guess it's sort of that, the idea that small can be beautiful as well. I guess the traditional finance sector has that tended in the past to focus on big investment, you know, big return, that sort of thing.
What I love about the discoveries that we found through things like the Grameen Bank is that it turns out that poor women are better at repaying their loans than some big corporations. So that was a real eye-opener to, I think, most of us in the world.
That doesn't surprise me, funnily enough. Which actually brings us back to, you know, the theme, the day that's coming up, International Women's Day. And I thought that these gender themes might be worth reflecting on. So you've had a lot of experience of being a woman in, that sounds terrible, doesn't it, as an isolated phrase, of being a woman within the corporate context, you know, on boards or reporting to boards, being around the table with business people. I believe you have an anecdote about another Molly that reflects on gender.
Well, it is, I have to apologize to the men in the room, but when I started my work at the White House, we had a council of 10 of the largest corporate sector CEOs. So we had pharmaceuticals and timber and oil, and so all the biggest guys, and they were all guys. And then we had the biggest environment and social CEOs. And it was very hard work. We argued about whether we had a finite planet or whether we had to have a growing economy for a year before we actually got beyond that. And it was really hard. And we had no staff and no budget. It was really interesting. We had the president's name, and I kept saying to the team, build it and he will come, but actually building it was quite difficult. At one point, the first woman head of the Fish and Wildlife Service, whose name was Molly Beatty, she put a little note on my door and it said, ancient Chinese proverb, man who says it cannot be done should not interrupt a woman who is doing it. And that's always stayed with me, not because of the sexist thing, and I do apologize to my male colleagues and my husband, who's done, you know, infinitely more than I ever have, but because it is, you know, sometimes when you're trying to do something really hard, you know, you just have these people saying you can't do it, or you got to do it the way I always did it, or breaking through is often really difficult, and that always inspires me. And Julie Bishop liked that quote too. She heard it recently, and she said she was going to use it in cabinet, and I thought, good on you.
Excellent. Actually, that sort of, I mean, doing a SWOT analysis, you know, for women in conservation, you know, what are the challenges as a woman in the corporate space, as well as the opportunities? What do you think we do well?
Look, I think it's hard to kind of generalize, but I do think that we have a different approach generally. We're more collaborative in how we work. We tend to be more collaborative. I think, you know, we tend to be more open to kind of wild ideas, new ideas. You know, I think there are a number of things, but I guess one of the things that I guess for me has been important is just perseverance. You know, the big changes that we are trying to achieve in the world take decades, not years, not weeks, not months. And so trying to just have the tenacity to kind of hang in there. And you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, she's always been such an inspiration to me, because if you look at what she was able to achieve, I mean, in the 1920s, she was talking about the fact that war is effectively caused by bad economics. And this was an idea that in the 1920s, you know, nobody else was talking about bad economics being the causes of war, really. And she had so much to kind of, you know, stumbling blocks to get in her way. And she just kept going with this vision that it can be better, we can do it differently, we can actually employ people, we can have prosperous economies. And she just took these challenges on one at a time. And I think that's something that we as you know, we learn that, I think, as mothers, you know, that you just have to persevere no matter what. And I think there's skills embedded in that, in facing some of these really long-term challenges.
Actually, I've sometimes said that necessity is the mother of invention, but motherhood's the inventor of necessity. Yeah. Or at least it is in my experience.
Indeed.
Finally, on that note, and I'm glad you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt, because my final question was going to be, who are your female role models? Who are your heroes? You know, who's inspired you in your career?
Well, many, and Eleanor Roosevelt certainly is one of them. But of the people I've had the great privilege to know, there was a woman when I was in the throes of the Greenpeace campaigning, and, you know, we were all burning out over the environment, you know, trials and tribulations. This woman came to Australia for a visit. Her name was Katrina Fokker. And she was the first, I think, president of the EU, when the EU didn't exist, really. I mean, it was kind of a concept in the... and she was 70, and I remember looking at her with her gray hair, you know, kind of propped up on her head, thinking how she was doing this amazing work, and here she was, 70 seemed like it was ancient at the time. And Philip's mother is actually 98, so, you know, it all, but I looked at her and I thought, you know, in order to really do this work, you've got to be able to sustain this, you know, just back to this perseverance and sustaining your ability to do that work. So she was a real inspiration to me, and she made me sort of sit back and say, it's no good burning out and being so passionate about what you do that you can't keep doing it. You need to find a way to be passionate and deeply engaged in what you're doing in ways that enable you to keep pushing for that long-term goal.
So I guess in some ways you have to look after yourself as
indeed.
well too.
So she would be one. Many that are amongst my contemporaries, I mean, Gretchen Daly, the work that she's done on ecosystem services is just transformative, you know, really, really groundbreaking. Hillary Clinton, I would consider among them. Like I mentioned, Julie Bishop at the moment is, you know, making a huge difference in my life. But I think of women like my mother, who just had a lot of wisdom and just shared that wisdom with me over many, many years. And yeah, many of my favorite people are in this room, so heroes, many among you.
Well, speaking of which, heroes and many of Molly's favourite people in the room, we actually have some time for questions. So we'll start off by giving you a preemptive thank you clap now. We'll give you another one at the end. But sit back and relax, Molly, while I sort of wander around the room. And if anyone has a question they'd like to ask Molly, pop your hand up and I'll come over with the roving mic. And there is a second microphone as well. So, oh, look, one here from the fair trade table. Was that planted?
That's not fair.
No, it's not planted, but I would like to hear Molly just say about the importance of the role of women within fair trade, because it's actually really interesting, the leadership and at the ground. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Thanks, Ali, for that question. Look, one of the big surprises to me when I was learning about fair trade on the International Board was the profound impact on democracy building and on women. So in the fair trade standards, there is requirements about how the premium is spent. So the way fair trade works is there's a minimum price, protects the farmers from the price going below the sustainable cost of production. There's the commodity, and then there's the premium on top. And that premium is spent by the whole community for hospitals, schools, whatever the community itself thinks it needs. And in the community, we don't, as fair trade, tell them how to spend that premium. They get to decide. But we do have very strict standards around how the decisions are made. And they include transparency in how the community is pulled together, how there's public minutes of these public meetings, and how women, for instance, are required to be able to vote even if they can't vote in the country, even if they can't own land in the country where these fair trade farms are. And it's amazing how just that little step of requiring that women get to participate in the decisions and the governance around how you spend that money is transformative for women in those communities. And it is a long-term building block for a completely different role for women in many of those societies. So it's a great question.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Hand over here.
Thanks. Hi, Ellen from the Greens. We talked a lot about impact investing and leveraging private money for conservation outcomes, and I know a lot of the organisations in this room do that incredibly successfully. Is there a danger that then we're taking away the responsibility of government and public money to actually invest in conservation? So, for example, here in Victoria, we've seen Parks Victoria defunded, and other private organisations almost have to step into that space to fund what I would consider something that the public purse should be paying for. My view is that it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other, but I do worry sometimes that we're taking away the responsibility from government, and we may never actually get that public investment back. So interested in your thoughts on that.
Sure. That's a really important point. And I guess what I would say is that we live in an increasingly unequal world. You know, 1% of the world's people control or have a controlling interest in 90% of the world's wealth. It's really quite extraordinary. And governments have increasingly had trouble with these kinds of things. I guess where I see government's role is in maybe what you define as capital stacking, where they can provide some of the insurance and some of the backbone of private investment so that there's credibility behind it, so that there's something substantial behind it. I think government has a really key role. And I think that where we succeed the most is where we've got that tripartite support, where you've got community organizations pushing for outcomes, whether it's in conservation or in some other aspect of sustainability, where you've got corporates that are engaged and actually providing in impact investment or that sort of thing, and where you've got governments in there backing it as well. I think that's often where we see the greatest benefit. But you're absolutely right. This trend towards governments. I mean, globally, healthcare in the United States. I mean, so few people have healthcare. It's extraordinary, and you sort of marvel that a rich country like the U.S. wouldn't have basic healthcare available for most people. So this is a trend that's alarming, and I think Australia. This is where Australia's leadership really has been quite impressive in things like education, healthcare, gun control. Those sorts of things we've been able to really excel at. But the ability of governments to manage large, funding of those sorts of things, we've got to keep supporting it, but we've got to keep the reality there too that we're going to have to pull in some of this private capital. It's the way of the world at the moment.
Which I think I have to add to that. I can't resist, because part of that question of government funding being spent on that has to also come with a support of people being willing to pay taxes in the same way that people often say with fair trade, I can't afford it, but the argument could be, can we afford not to? Can you comment on that role at that level?
Indeed. Well, I guess one of the things that excited me most about what the G20 was doing while they were in Brisbane was actually looking at this whole issue of tax evasion and how to get a grip on it. Because it's absolutely true that if you've got 90% of the world's wealth tied up in 1% of the world's population, how else are we going to be able to address these? So I think I think these are really important ways of addressing more equity. I mean, the world now is so unequal. 7 out of 10 people, Oxfam did a fantastic report recently that showed that 7 out of 10 people live in a country that's less equal than it was 10 years ago. South Africa is less equal now than it was when apartheid passed. So our ability to ensure that we've got a strong tax base, that we've got people willing to and recognizing their role is really important. But I think what you'll find is that most people that have those kinds of resources would rather choose how to invest it rather than pay taxes. But hopefully we'll be able, as we have been, we've been consistently able to solve some of these problems. And I think if we can get a global handle on dealing with tax evasion at that global level where money just goes flowing through global systems, then we will have a big opportunity to invest in the things that we need to in the world.
I'll hand back to you guys. Do we have another question? One here. Good.
A lot of the problems underlying all this seem to be the gross economy in a finite world. So I'm just wondering whether with a green capital, and I'm not an economist, I'm an ecologist, but how you get around that whole thing that seems to be creating the issue.
Well, this was the argument that we had for the first year of the council. Do we have to have a growing economy? I think that the way we broke that down was growth in what? So with a population that's currently something like 6 billion growing to 9, something's going to grow, and lots of things are not going to grow. So I guess one of the things that we have to be wary of is polarizing issues to the point where people don't see through the same prism. I mean, the council had this difference of view that we had a finite planet versus a growing economy, and there the twain should meet. And it only broke down when we actually said, well, what is it specifically that we want to grow? Do we want climate impacts to grow? No. Do we want teenage pregnancies to grow? No. So as soon as you get down to the specifics, and this is why in many places in the world, local initiatives are more successful than some of these big global treaties, because actually at the local level it's specific and people can actually address it in a specific way. But we do have to keep that global picture, because today we have 70% of our food grown by people that are on the whole earning, the hungriest people in the world, earning less than $2 a day often. So we have these crazy dichotomies that if we can't keep that think global, act local perspective, then we won't be able to address some of these really, really big challenges. But growth is one of those flag words. It's like a red rag to a bull. It can incite people like population control or something in ways that don't help us to get to a better understanding of what's the action we need to take. So I guess I would just caution that we need to think a little broadly about what it means and what needs to grow, because lots of things need to grow. You know, the people that have enough food on the table, that needs to grow in the world.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Ladies and gentlemen, can you join me in giving a really big hand to Molly?
Thank you.
Now, don't go far. I'm now going to invite Louise Sylvan from Bush Heritage Australia to the stage because she wants to thank Molly on behalf of the Trust for Nature and Bush Heritage.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Molly, for that incredibly inspiring speech that you gave. I've been sitting beside Philip Toyne, Molly's husband, for breakfast, and I must tell you a little story that we reminded ourselves about in terms of how Molly got into the fair trade space.
Oh!
You were sort of in it, but not quite at international level at that point, and I got a call on my sister-in-law's brother was in Germany and headed the International Fair Trade Organization. He said, we're looking for people from the Antipodean area who've really got, and he went through these incredible list of characteristics that they wanted for their board. And I said, well, you know, I've just been talking to a couple of people about fair trade. They happen to be married, and I'm going to send you the CVs from both of them. And here's Molly's CV, and here's Philip's CV. And they came back to me and said, we'd like to talk to Molly. And Philip has never forgiven me. So it's funny how things swing around and come about. But Molly, that was truly inspiring, and it's so inspiring to be here on International Women's Day and have the opportunity to hear you talk, not only about your environmental passion, but about social impact as well. We've got a little gift up here coming for you, but I just want to say in particular on behalf of Bush Heritage Australia that you've had a very, very long association with, of course. Philip was chair for 9 years before I was, so we both know this organization really well. And also on behalf of Camilla Graves, the chair of Trust for Nature, that this is a fabulous morning that we have each year. This was sold out. As you know, we've got about 360 people in the room to celebrate International Women's Day, to celebrate environment, to celebrate social impact investing, and 60% of you have been before. So you've come again to participate in this event, which is extraordinary. And you answered a question which I think is really important, because I spend a little bit of time in the social impact investing space. In fact, Rosemary Addis, who heads social impact investing in Australia, is also sitting at my table, is doing fabulous work in terms of Australia's positioning in the world. But you answered a question that I thought was really critical, and Premier Mike Baird in New South Wales just launched the New South Wales social impact policy and committed to doing a couple of deals a year. And he kind of said, governments are under enormous fiscal pressure. He knows that. He was treasurer. He looked at all the bad news. He said, and we cannot go forward as a society with governments trying to take all of the load and what they can't manage to do well, trying to polyphila with philanthropy. There's got to be another way, and this is the way that's coming forward for us to try and take. So I think it's really important to see that we're all in this wonderful space and trying to think of new and innovative ways to really mobilize private capital as well to help the social good. But Molly, thank you again for an inspiring morning, and thank you, Tanya, for your interview. And just as I close, can I have you just stop? And we've provided the names of everybody who was here today. But have you just stop and look around your table and look around the room at the leadership that is here and how far we've come. We've got a big, big task. I know, Molly, as you said, it's, decades and decades and hundreds of years. But I don't know if you felt the energy as you walked out of the elevator and just got the buzz. It seems to me we've got a lot of opportunity to succeed in that innovation and creativity. So thank you all for coming this morning.